Hello, welcome back to the channel. You know, some people have asked me, what non-astronomy science books do you recommend that I read? And I've got a few of them here. I'll probably just go through some of these quickly. Some of these I'll talk about, but I like all of these books. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first on the list is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, Oliver Sacks. He's a neurologist, and he writes about strange cases that he's seen. The title story is about a man who's a musician, and everything seemed normal with him, especially when he was talking about music, but every once in a while his brain would malfunction. And the title comes from the fact that when he tried to leave, he tried to pull his wife's head up because he thought it was a hat. And this is just a condition that happens to some people, and he writes about it. There's another touching story in here about a little girl from India who had cancer, and it was a tumor in her brain, and they were able to successfully remove it. But they told her this kind of cancer usually comes back, so she knew she was living on borrowed time. And about 10 years or so later, the cancer did come back, and she knew that it was over. And the tumor began pressing on her brain, and they kept asking her, what do you perceive? You know, what is your perception? And she said, I'm happy. I'm back in India. And as time went on, she grew into this catatonic state, and all she talked about is she was happy because she was back in India in her mind. And when they talked it over, they said, you know what, the best thing to do is nothing because she's happy. And a few days later, she passed away. Okay, next book on the list. Salt, Sugar, Fat. Now, if you've read Food Inc. and if you've read Fast Food Nation, this one should be on your reading list as well. It's divided into 3 parts with all 3 of these on them, and it tells you why these things are bad for you. Now, the human brain seems hardwired to crave salt, sugar, and fat. And I think most of us are aware that sugar and fat are bad for us, but the one that slipped under the radar is salt. The levels of sodium in our foods are growing by a lot each year, to the point where by some measures we are eating somewhere between 5 and 20 times the amount of sodium that our body needs. And when this happens in your bloodstream, the heart has to work extra hard because it views it as a toxin to try to flush it out of your system. Hence the near epidemic we have of hypertension, high blood pressure. But anyway, it's a good book to read if you're thinking about altering your diet. Okay, next book on the list. When Breath Becomes Air. This is a sad book. It's a Stanford student who had a promising future as a doctor, and he discovered that he had lung cancer. And this is a chronicle of his final days. You see, it's not a very long book here. He didn't live to complete the book. Somebody had to complete this for him. You could probably read this in one sitting, but it took me a while to read this one because I just kept stopping and thinking about my own life. You know, if I knew that I had a short time to live, you know, how would I spend my days? And you would think this is a sad book, but it's not. It's actually quite uplifting about how he looks at life. I highly recommend this. Take a look. Next book on the list. Richard Rhodes. This is a classic. The Making of the Atomic Bomb, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and all these other awards. Now, if you like the movie Oppenheimer, and I know very few people who didn't like that movie, it was based in part on this book, and it's a big book. You can really delve into this and geek out on it. Now, for me, it's a little bit textbooky, and that could be a plus or a minus for you, depending on how much detail you like in your books. But this is definitely one that should be on your to-read list. Okay, next one. Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. This is a great book, and I'll tell you, of all the books here, if I had to pick one to reread right now, it would probably be this one. I'm not saying it's the greatest book on this list, it's just the one that I think I would want to read right now. She writes with such humor and affection for her topic that you can't help but get caught up in the things that she's saying. You know, she gets into all kinds of things about death and dying and the human cadaver. You know, in the old days, everybody's greatest fear is being buried alive or being pronounced dead when you're not really dead. And in the old days, before medicine was perfected, they used to tie a bell around part of your body, so in case you did wake up in the morgue, they would hear the bell and they would come running. Hence the phrase, saved by the bell. But after a while, all the years they'd been doing this, not one person had ever come alive, and so they discontinued this practice. That's just one chapter. There's a lot more in here. It's a great book. You should read this. Okay, let's see. You know, I could have picked any number of books by Richard Fineman, and I've got 3 of them here because I just can't pick one of them. The one that probably most people would recommend is What Do You Care What Other People Think? Or Surely You're Joking, Mr. Fineman. You know, I like this one because it has the story about the Space Shuttle Challenger. Now, when the Challenger disaster happened, I remember exactly what I was doing. I was a student and I was waiting to get a haircut, and there was a monitor on the wall, and when I saw it happen, I couldn't really process what was going on until I realized, yes, something had gone wrong. But they selected him to be on the panel to try to determine what happened. And he said to his wife at the time, "I don't know anything about space shuttles. Why did they pick me?" And his wife said, "That's exactly why you need to be on this panel, because everybody else there has been looking into this. They're too close to the subject. You're going to be thinking outside the box, and if anybody can find out what was wrong, it's going to be you." It shows a page from his notebook, and it was amazing. The very first page of the very first meeting that he had, he solved the problem. He figured out what it was, but he didn't know at the time that he had figured out what the problem was. And the problem had to do with expansion. You know, things heat up and they cool down a lot in space travel. And one of the solutions they had was this O-ring, and the O-ring would expand when things get hot, and they would actually depend on that to form a seal so that things didn't get past the seal. But if the temperature was below about 55 degrees, there was a caution about not flying the space shuttle because the O-ring would be hard and cold and it wouldn't expand enough and there would be blow-by. And that's in fact what happened, and he figured it out. Now, to do this demonstration, he was on a panel and he asked for a glass of cold ice water, and he had a piece of the O-ring that he was going to show. He was going to dunk it in the water and then show that it didn't decompress. Well, the people are speaking and they're coming down to where he is, and there's no water. And he realizes, if there's no water, I have nothing to say. This is the only thing I have prepared. The last second, someone did bring him a glass of ice water, and the rest is history. He compressed it, put the O-ring in the water, and then realized when they pulled it out that it did not decompress. That was the problem. So these 2 books, probably the ones you're going to see recommended the most, but this one, The Meaning of It All, is less well known. I'm going to recommend this. This is a transcription of 3 speeches that he had done, and boy, I would be thrilled to give speeches the way this guy did. You can read this in one sitting. I am just in awe of his ability to organize thoughts. Okay, moving right along, another Pulitzer Prize-winning book. I think everybody should read this. The Emperor of All Maladies. This is a book about cancer. Now, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of us, sometime in our lives, will get cancer. And this is a big book again. You may like that or you may not like big books, but he writes so well. This is a terrific book. It goes by very quickly. And again, I think everybody should read this book. Okay. Did you ever read a book that was so good that as soon as you got finished reading it, you went right back to the beginning and started reading it again? Well, this is one of them. I have multiple copies of Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. This is a chronicle of the 1996 Everest mountain disaster. And like a lot of things that go wrong, it wasn't any one thing that happened. It was a series of little things that had gone wrong that compounded and added to the problem, and you have this complete disaster where a bunch of people died. I have multiple copies of this book. I have the hardcover. I have the annotated edition. I have another copy that I've loaned out, and I probably read this book 3 or 4 times. It's supposed to be a cautionary tale, but he writes with such a sense of zest and adventure. He actually kind of makes it look kind of fun, which I don't think was his intention. But anyway, one of my favorite books of all time. Okay. Some of you may know that I was a cyclist at one point. I raced in the amateur divisions, and from Lance to Landis, this is a shocking expose of the drug culture that went on in cycling. You read this with your heart in your throat. You can't believe that such things went on. So the drug that everybody used was called EPO, and ironically, when Lance Armstrong got cancer, EPO was a drug that they would use because it stimulates the growth of red blood cells. Well, athletes began figuring out if they took EPO recreationally, so to speak, it would improve their performance. And the people who benefited the most tended to be swimmers, cyclists, and runners. Now, the problem with EPO is it makes your blood very thick. And when you're very fit, your heart rate drops quite a bit to the point where it's even in the 30s when you sleep. And during a time in the 1990s when EPO was unchecked here, there was an epidemic of riders dying in their sleep because as your heart rate slows, it can't pump the blood and you have a heart attack and you die. And this is almost hilarious if it wasn't so tragic, but people would wear heart rate monitors, and if the heart rate dipped below a certain point, you had to wake up in a hurry, there was an alarm that would go off, and there was a trainer by your bed, and you would get on the trainer and you would ride your bike. And there was a story about how a new racer had gotten into one of these hotels that housed all of the cyclists, and he was thinking, boy, these cyclists are really dedicated. They're getting up in the middle of the night and riding their bikes. Little did he know. Okay, another one of these books. There are 3 books here that are so good that as soon as I finished reading them, I started all over again. This is the second one, The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. Ann Rule was a retired police officer working the suicide hotline in Seattle, and working with her was this handsome, kind, polite young man who seemed very good at his job. And at the time, there was a string of grisly murders for young women happening around the area, and they would kind of talk about this. Well, the kind, handsome, sensitive young man working next to her was Ted Bundy. Now, this becomes almost a Truman Capote-like situation. She becomes a part of the story because after he got caught, she almost couldn't allow herself to believe that he had done these things, even though she was a police officer and knew all the evidence was there and he had done these things. And even after he had confessed, she would go to prison and bring him cigarettes. And I'm sitting here reading the book and I'm almost talking back to the book like, no, don't do that. Anyway, they got Ted Bundy to confess to 36 murders. They convicted him on 3. He got 3 consecutive life sentences. Now, people can be pro-death penalty or you could be anti-death penalty. But when people have that argument, the Ted Bundy case always comes up. He had 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He escaped twice from a maximum security prison. The first time he was promptly caught. The second time he had learned his lesson. By the time the guards had noticed he was gone, he was already in Florida and had assumed another identity. And he vowed to himself that he would never do this again. And the vow lasted a few days. He broke into a house where there were a bunch of young women living there, and he killed a bunch of them. And it's such a gripping story. I've read a lot of Ann Rule's books, and she's very, very good, but this is her masterpiece, The Stranger Beside Me. Okay, if you're interested in Stonehenge, some of you may have seen the video that I had done where I was at Stonehenge this past winter for the winter solstice. This was the textbook that they used in the class that I took at Oxford. This is probably considered the definitive text on Stonehenge, and after reading all of this, one of the main conclusions is we don't know a lot. There's more that we don't know than there is that we do know because it was so long ago. Anyway, recommended. Okay, down to the last few. This is a good one. Truth Doesn't Have a Side, Bennett Omalu. Omalu is the doctor credited for discovering this CTE, the head injury thing with football players. He's from Nigeria, and he admits that he was naive. He was a young doctor, he wanted to get to the United States, and he thought the United States was this great place where everybody always did the right thing, and everybody's always smiling, and everybody's always happy. He admits he was naive because, as we know, things aren't always that way. Well, there was a football player that came on his autopsy table named Mike Webster. He played for the Pittsburgh Steelers. There was an official cause of death, but when he examined the brain, he found these lesions in the brain that resembled Alzheimer's, but it was a little bit different. And he began to study this, and it turned out, someone figured out that through the course of his career, Mike Webster had played in over 70,000 plays, and in many of those, he had his head hit. He didn't have a documented concussion. And what Omalu says is people are focusing too much on the concussions and not on the blows to the head, which is what actually causes this. Now, he doesn't say that people shouldn't play football. In fact, he actually says he thinks football is a beautiful game. He just wishes it didn't hurt people's heads and did things to people. So when he first found this, he admits he was naive. He thought the NFL would be thanking him for pointing this out, and instead the opposite happened. His life got ruined. He lost his job. He lost his house. They demanded that he retract the paper and admit that he had made the whole thing up, and it was just a huge mess. But I'll tell you, this guy has such a kind spirit and still a positive outlook on life despite all of the things that had happened to him, that I just found myself just smiling as I'm reading this, because he always tries to do the right thing. When he has a body on the table in front of him at an autopsy, he always introduces himself out loud to the body, and he thanks the body for allowing him to tell the story about how his last days went. So just a very interesting guy, and an interesting medical book, and it's an interesting sports book, all rolled into one. Okay, down to the last two books here. This is the last of the three books that as soon as I got finished reading them, I started all over again. Midnight in Chernobyl. This is a best-selling book. It documents what happened that night in what is now Ukraine at the Chernobyl nuclear facility. And again, like Into Thin Air, it wasn't one thing that went wrong, it was a series of little things that had gone wrong. And when this happened, we don't study the effects of radiation on the human body because you can't do it, but we wound up doing it by default because of what happened here. And when the meltdown occurred, they sent people in to try to evaluate this. And what we now know is if you're near radiation and you taste metallic sensations in your mouth, you're gone. You're not going to live much longer. They flew helicopters over the facility to try to dump things into what was the nuclear reactor to try to stop it. And they would do this all day, and then they would park the helicopters at night. The guys would sleep, and then they'd get up in the morning and they'd do the same thing over again. In the morning, when these guys woke up, the grass underneath the helicopters had died. That's how strong the radiation was, and these guys died as well. When they treated them in the hospital, they had to scrub down the hospital walls because the guys were so irradiated, they actually started to affect the walls in the hospital itself. Really, really tragic stuff, and it's a fascinating, riveting book, and this is one of my top recommendations for any science-related book. Okay, last one. Atul Gawande. He's a doctor, and I have three books here. There's Complications, Better, and then my favorite book here is called Being Mortal, and I can't show this to you because I have two copies and I've given them both out. I've loaned them out to people and I don't have them back yet. He writes about how doctors are human beings too, and they try to do the right things, but sometimes they make mistakes. In one of these books, I think it's this one, he was a new doctor and somebody had asked him to intubate a patient to put a central line into his heart, and you've got to kind of go in through a vein. And it was the first time doing it, and the doctor there said, okay, you go ahead and do this. And he kept poking the patient, and he couldn't find the central line. He couldn't do it. And so he didn't want to alarm the patient, so he kept looking over at the doctor. He said he was pleading with his eyes and his eyebrows, please, just do this for me. I'll do the next one. The doctor wouldn't have anything of it. He said, you've got to do it. By now, the patient's getting really uncomfortable. And eventually, he did it. He felt the needle go in. He said it was a great sensation. And he knew from that point on that things were going to be fine. Now, in Being Mortal, he talks about ethical concerns about when we all pass. In the old days, middle part of the last century, when we died, we tended to die at home. Then in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, we tended to die in hospitals. Since that time, we tend to die in these places that we've put up for people, that where we, if you're wealthy enough to come in there, you can be there and live there when there's a medical facility nearby. And he sort of questions, what's the right way to do this sort of thing? He talks about when his own father had passed, and he had called someone from the hospice facility over, and the father was a doctor, and he was a doctor, and the person from the facility was a doctor, and they talked about, how do we treat this person's final days? 3 doctors in the room, and not one of them knew what to do. And that's one of his messages. Sometimes we don't know what to do. He also talks about some other things, about the internal affairs effect on doctors. For example, let's say you have a doctor who was once very well known and very competent, but perhaps is aging and his faculties are starting to fail him. There's supposed to be a system in place to deal with all of this, but according to him, apparently nobody uses it. They're embarrassed, it's an uncomfortable situation. Let's say the doctor could have been your mentor. The doctor could have taught you everything that you knew. The doctor could have been your father. Are you going to report your own father? This is a very uncomfortable situation, and he talks about how we approach these things. About a year ago, I had surgery, and as I was recuperating, I read all of Gawande's books. And despite the fact that he talks about fallacies with doctors, I actually found his words very comforting because he's very kind in the way that he writes. All right, folks, there you have it, a list of non-astronomy related science books that I recommend. Do you have others that you can recommend for me? I'd like to see those. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.